Hey guys, tonight we're going to sink into the sands of time, drifting back to ancient Egypt, a land where colossal monuments pierced the sky and a living god walked among mere mortals. Imagine, if you will, the scorching sun beating down on your brow, the dried dust of the desert clinging to your skin as you watch a procession of unimaginable opulence, led by a figure shimmering with gold and jewels. This isn't your average history lesson. We're peeling back the gilded veneer to uncover the gritty, often disturbing reality of what it meant to be a pharaoh. You might think being a god king sounds like a sweet gig, all power and luxury. But trust me, the divine right came with a very heavy, very pointy crown. You probably won't survive this journey into their daily lives without at least one existential sigh. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now in the comments. It's always wild to think about us all connecting across time zones and continents, just chilling out to some history. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the precipice of understanding, looking not at the serene, idealized statues you see in museums, but at the raw, often terrifying truth of the pharaoh's existence. From a moment the sun kissed the eastern horizon, their day was less about lounging by the Nile and more about an endless parade of rituals, decrees, and the crushing weight of divine expectation. They weren't just rulers. They were the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, responsible for the very rhythm of the universe. If the Nile didn't flood, if the crops failed, if the sun seemed a little less bright that day, guess whose fault it was? Yours, the Pharaohs. Every sneeze could be interpreted as a bad omen, every stumble a sign of divine displeasure. Imagine trying to get through your morning without accidentally incurring the wrath of cosmic forces because you stubbed your toe on the sarcophagus. This wasn't a job you clocked out of. You were born into it, wrapped in linen, swaddling clothes that probably felt less like comfort and more like a pre-mummification straitjacket. From infancy, you were groomed for divinity, taught the complex religious texts, the intricate political dance, and the unwavering belief in your own godhood. Mainstream historical fact: the pharaoh was considered the intermediary between the gods and the people, and maintaining that cosmic order and justice was their primary responsibility. This wasn't just a philosophical concept. It was an active duty that permeated every aspect of their lives, from judging disputes to performing intricate temple rituals daily. And those rituals? They weren't just for show. You'd be up before dawn, purifying yourself with water from a sacred spring, dressing in elaborate robes, and then spending hours performing offerings to various deities. Think about your morning routine coffee, maybe a quick shower, scroll through social media. The pharaoh's equivalent involved chanting incantations, burning incense, and perhaps even sacrificing an animal, all while surrounded by priests who watch your every move for any sign of imperfection. One quirky tidbit: some pharaohs reportedly kept sacred baboons or falcons within their private chambers, believing these animals were direct conduits to the gods, making for some rather messy and undoubtedly noisy divine communication. You just know one of those baboons probably swiped a royal date or two. The pressure then was immense. Every decision, every public appearance, every utterance carried the weight of national destiny. Historians still argue whether the pharaohs genuinely believed in their own divinity or if it was a shrewd political tool to maintain absolute control. Was it a carefully constructed illusion for the masses, or were they truly convinced they communed with Ra himself over breakfast? Either way, the performance was relentless. You couldn't just have an off day, slacking on your divine duties because you felt a bit peckish or had a headache. The entire kingdom's fate rested on your shoulders, a responsibility that would crush most modern leaders, let alone someone who also had to worry about their eternal soul and building a giant, pointy house for it. As if the divine duties weren't enough, you, the pharaoh, were also tasked with arguably the most ambitious construction projects in human history: the pyramids. This wasn't just about building a fancy tomb. It was a physical manifestation of your divinity, a stairway to the stars, and a very public works project designed to unify a vast, sometimes fractious, kingdom. You might imagine a few architects sketching ideas on papyrus scrolls, maybe a contractor or two overseeing things, but the reality was far more immense and, frankly, terrifying for the vast majority of the population. You would issue the decree, perhaps with a casual flick of your wrist, and then the gears of a monumental, nationwide effort would grind into motion. Imagine the logistical nightmare, securing vast quarries, often hundreds of miles away, and then somehow transporting millions of tons of stone, some blocks weighing more than several elephants combined, across land and water. This wasn't done with modern machinery, obviously. We're talking about sheer, brutal, human muscle, ropes, wooden sledges, and a whole lot of sweat and tears. Mainstream historical fact: the Great Pyramid of Giza alone is estimated to have used around 2.3 million stone blocks, each averaging about 2.5 tons, and was likely constructed over a period of 20 years. That's a block every 2.5 minutes, day and night, for 2 decades. Just let that sink in. You'd send out your overseers, cracking the whip sometimes, literalito, gather the necessary workforce. This wasn't entirely slave labor in the modern sense, not uniformly at least. Many were skilled craftsmen, but a massive portion were conscripted peasants, forced to abandon their fields during the annual Nile flood, when farming was impossible. They were volunteered, let's say for this divine service, trudging for weeks or months to the Giza Plateau, leaving their families to fend for themselves. Imagine being told you had to leave your home to haul rocks for years, with the promise of divine favor, or, more likely, just not getting beaten as your only compensation. The conditions were, to put it mildly, abhorrent. Accidents were commonplace. Crushing injuries from falling blocks, heat stroke under the relentless sun, exhaustion, disease spreading like wildfire through densely packed work camps. A quirky tidbit discovered through archaeological digs near the pyramid sites shows evidence of sophisticated medical care for broken bones, suggesting that while the work was dangerous, there was an economic incentive to keep the workers alive, or at least patched up enough to keep working. Still, for every bone set, how many succumbed to infection or simply vanished beneath a collapsing ramp? You were the God King, yes, but your divine blueprint often meant unimaginable suffering for thousands of your subjects. And the ramps. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians used a single, long ramp, a spiraling ramp around the pyramid, or an internal ramping system to lift those massive stones. Imagine the perpetual dust, the constant shouting, the rhythmic groan of ropes, the smell of sweat and fear, day in and day out, for decades. You, as the pharaoh, might visit the site occasionally, perhaps gliding by in a palanquin, adorned in your regalia, offering a quick blessing that probably meant very little to the half-starved workers straining against a massive block. For them, your pyramid wasn't a symbol of eternal glory, but a testament to endless toil and often premature death. It was a visible reminder of your absolute power, yes, but also of your complete disregard for their individual lives. A god can't be bothered with trivialities like worker safety, can they? You had an afterlife to secure, after all, and that required a rather large, pointy insurance policy. Life within the royal palace, you might assume, was a constant state of decadent leisure. Think sprawling gardens, endless feasts, and servants fanning you with ostrich feathers while you nap. And while there were elements of that, the reality was also a relentless cycle of often bizarre rituals and practices designed to maintain not only your own power, but the cosmic order itself. Your day wasn't just about issuing commands. It was a performance, a constant enactment of your divine role, often involving things that would make your modern self raise a very skeptical eyebrow. Imagine waking up and your first duty isn't checking your royal emails, but participating in a purification ceremony, involving chanting specific incantations and being doused with water by priests. Breakfast might involve meticulously prepared foods believed to have magical properties, and every garment you wore, every piece of jewelry, was imbued with symbolic meaning and protective amulets. Your walk through the palace gardens wasn't a leisurely stroll, but a carefully choreographed procession, observed by courtiers who prostrated themselves as you passed. Mainstream historical fact: the pharaoh was the chief priest of all of Egypt, and religious rituals were integral to their daily life, believed to ensure the continued favor of the gods and the stability of the Nile floods. Then there were the state rituals, grand affairs involving processions to temples, offerings to deities, and public appearances designed to reinforce your divine connection. Think of the Opet festival at Karnak, where the statues of the Theban triad were carried in a grand procession along the Nile. As the pharaoh, you would play a central role, often performing symbolic acts of union with the divine, watched by thousands of your subjects. These weren't just photo ops. They were believed to have real, tangible effects on the well-being of the kingdom. If you flubbed a line in the sacred chant, or looked a bit under the weather, who knows what chaos might ensue. But it wasn't all grand processions and chanting. Some of the daily rituals could be downright unsettling. A quirky or fringe tidbit involves the practice of pharaohs wearing leopard skins during certain ceremonies. While seemingly symbolic of power and ferocity, some interpretations suggest a more ancient, possibly even shamanistic connection to the animal spirit world. Imagine trying to conduct affairs of state while draped in a slightly smelly leopard pelt. Did anyone ever try to pet you? And then there was the constant awareness of your own mortality, despite your supposed divinity. The elaborate preparations for the afterlife, the construction of your tomb, the overseeing of the mummification process, these were ongoing concerns. You weren't just ruling a kingdom in the present. You were actively planning for your eternal future. Historians still argue whether the intense focus on the afterlife stemmed from genuine religious belief or a fear of oblivion. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a way to reconcile their seemingly immortal status with the undeniable fact that even god kings eventually kicked the royal bucket. Your daily life was a tightrope walk between divine expectation and human frailty. You were revered, worshipped even, but also constantly scrutinized. Every action was imbued with significance, every word potentially carrying immense weight. You couldn't just relax and be yourself. You were always on, playing the role of the omnipotent, flawless ruler. It's enough to make you crave a nice, anonymous existence as a sandal maker, just without the pressure of ensuring the sun rises on time. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we haven't even gotten to yet? Just a little taste of the delightful, everyday practices you might have encountered. Your food was probably amazing, though. We can give them that. While your public life as pharaoh was a dazzling, ritualistic performance of divine power, your private existence within the palace walls was a far more treacherous affair, a swirling vortex of ambition, betrayal, and constant paranoia. You might think being a god king would mean absolute security, but it often meant being surrounded by people who coveted your power or simply wanted to influence it for their own gain. The palace wasn't just a home. It was a viper's nest where every whispered word could be a dagger and every meal a potential death sentence. You couldn't just trust anyone. Your closest advisors, your most loyal courtiers, even members of your own family, everyone had an agenda. Succession was a constant, gnawing anxiety. If you had a strong heir, rivals might try to eliminate them. If you didn't, or if your heir was perceived as weak, factions would begin to jockey for position, even before you took your last breath. Mainstream historical fact: many pharaohs faced assassination attempts or met mysterious ends, with historical records often vague or deliberately misleading about the true causes of death to maintain the illusion of divine invincibility. Think about the fate of Ramesses III, who was almost certainly murdered in a harem conspiracy, his throat slit according to modern forensic analysis of his mummy. Not exactly a peaceful transition of power. Imagine every cup of wine offered to you, every morsel of food, being scrutinized by a royal taster. You'd probably develop a twitch, wouldn't you? This wasn't just a precautionary measure. It was a vital part of your daily routine. Poisons were known, and often undetectable. A quirky tidbit: Some ancient Egyptian texts hint at specialized poison masters or experts in concocting insidious substances from plants and minerals, capable of delivering a slow, agonizing demise or a swift, silent one, making dinner parties a genuinely high-stakes affair. You'd definitely be skipping the potluck. The harem conspiracy against Ramesses III is perhaps the most famous example of this palace intrigue. His minor wife, Tai, wanted her son Penaware on the throne instead of the designated heir. This wasn't just a family squabble. It involved high-ranking officials, army commanders, and servants. Imagine your own queen plotting your demise with a network of conspirators right under your divine nose. You'd probably spend half your time wondering if that sudden cough your vizier had was just a cold, or if he just slipped something into your chamomile tea. Historians still argue whether some pharaohs who supposedly died of natural causes, especially those with short or unexpected reigns, were actually victims of poisoning or other forms of foul play. The limited medical knowledge of the time, coupled with the desire to maintain the divine image of the pharaoh, meant that many deaths were simply attributed to the will of the gods. But behind the scenes, you knew the whispers, the shifting alliances, the glint in an ambitious official's eye. You couldn't afford to show weakness. A moment of perceived vulnerability could be seized upon by rivals. You had to maintain an aura of untouchable authority, even as you internally second-guessed every single person around you. It was a lonely existence at the top, constantly aware that your divine status wouldn't protect you from a well-aimed dagger in the dark, or a slow-acting toxin slipped into your evening snack. Being a god king sounds great until you realize your job also includes chief food taster. Beyond the immediate threats of palace intrigue, you, the pharaoh, faced a more insidious, long-term danger woven into the very fabric of royal succession, the disturbing reality of deliberate inbreeding. While it might seem completely alien and horrifying to us today, for ancient Egyptian royalty, marrying within the immediate family siblings, half-siblings, even parents was a common, often expected practice. This wasn't driven by romantic love, but by a chillingly pragmatic desire to keep the royal bloodline pure, to concentrate divine power, and to prevent any dilution of the sacred lineage that supposedly flowed directly from the gods themselves. Imagine the pressure to marry your own sister, not just for political alliance, but because it was believed to literally solidify your claim to the throne, echoing the mythical marriage of the gods Osiris and Isis. Mainstream historical fact: incestuous marriages were common in the royal families of ancient Egypt, particularly during the New Kingdom, with pharaohs like Akhenaten marrying his sister and Tutankhamun marrying his half-sister, Inkhesenamun. This was seen as mirroring divine precedents and ensuring the purity of the royal line. It sounds less like a royal wedding and more like a very uncomfortable family reunion. The consequence of this relentless pursuit of genetic purity, however, was anything but pure. Generations of inbreeding led to a host of debilitating health issues, deformities, and genetic weaknesses that would plague the royal family. Think about the famous case of Tutankhamun. Modern genetic analysis of his mummy has revealed a litany of ailments: a club foot, a cleft palate, Kohler's disease, a painful bone disorder, and scoliosis. He likely walked with a limp and suffered chronic pain, all before dying young, possibly from a combination of his weakened state and a severe leg fracture. A quirky tidbit: some scholars suggest that the royal disease or a pharaonic ailment alluded to in ancient texts might actually refer to the cumulative effects of generations of inbreeding, manifesting as physical deformities or intellectual disabilities among some rulers. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians fully understood the biological ramifications of their inbreeding practices, or if their religious and political justifications simply outweighed any observed physical deformities. Did they see these ailments as divine tests, or simply the unfortunate side effects of maintaining divine purity? You, as pharaoh, might have grown up seeing relatives with unusual physical traits, perhaps explaining them away as unique marks of their divine lineage rather than the result of a dangerously narrow gene pool. It's hard to imagine ruling an empire while battling constant pain or struggling with a significant physical disability, all while trying to project an image of perfect, godlike health. The pressure to produce an heir, a healthy heir, must have been immense. Every royal birth would have been watched with bated breath, searching for signs of perfection or dreading the appearance of an unfortunate birth defect. And what if the child was born with obvious problems? It would have been a profoundly disturbing secret, carefully managed to maintain the illusion of divine flawlessness. You couldn't just announce, "Oops, turns out marrying my sister wasn't the best idea for genetic diversity." The dynasty had to continue, come what may, even if it meant sacrificing the physical well-being of its very members. It was a disturbing cycle, where the quest for divine perfection led directly to human imperfection, hidden behind a veil of gold and glory. With a body that might be riddled with the effects of royal inbreeding and a mind constantly on edge from palace conspiracies, your existence as pharaoh then turned to the grim realities of ancient Egyptian medicine and, inevitably, your own mortality. Despite your divine status, you were just as susceptible to illness, injury, and the ravages of time as any commoner, perhaps even more so, given the unique pressures of your role. But unlike us, you didn't have access to antibiotics or advanced surgical techniques. Your medical care was a bizarre blend of practical knowledge, magical incantations, and truly disturbing ingredients. Imagine falling ill. Instead of a sterile hospital room, you'd be attended by priests and physicians who operated on a blend of empirical observation and deeply held religious beliefs. Mainstream historical fact: ancient Egyptian medicine was surprisingly advanced in some areas, particularly in bone setting and basic surgery, as evidenced by medical papyri like the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which describes anatomical observations and the treatment of injuries in a rational manner. However, this coexisted with practices rooted in magic and superstition. So, you might get a carefully dressed wound, but also a magical amulet hung around your neck. For a pharaoh, every ailment was scrutinized for its divine significance. Was it a punishment from the gods? A curse from an enemy? Or just a really bad case of the Nile belly? Treatment often involved concoctions that would make your stomach churn. A quirky tidbit: ancient Egyptian remedies included ingredients like animal dung, particularly crocodile dung for skin ailments, and a delightful mix of honey, moldy bread, and various herbs. You might have been prescribed a poultice of rotting meat for a wound, or a potion containing pulverized precious stones, all delivered with an earnest belief in their efficacy. Imagine the royal physician presenting you with a steaming cup of something that smelled suspiciously like fermented pond scum. You'd probably grimace, but as pharaoh, you'd drink it, because what choice did you have? And then, of course, there was the omnipresent obsession with the afterlife. Your entire reign was a preparation for eternity. Mummification wasn't just a funeral rite. It was an elaborate, months-long process designed to preserve your body so that your life force and personality could return to it in the afterlife. You, as pharaoh, would oversee the construction of your tomb, perhaps visiting the artisans carving your sarcophagus, or approving the spellbinding text to be inscribed on the walls, ensuring your eternal journey was well provisioned. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians' meticulous mummification practices were driven primarily by a literal belief in physical resurrection, or by a more symbolic desire for eternal remembrance and the continuity of the royal line. Either way, the process itself was rather undignified, even for a god king. First, your brain would be extracted through your nostrils with a hook. Try not to think about that too much. Then your internal organs, lungs, liver, intestines, stomach would be removed, washed, and placed in canopic jars, leaving only your heart, believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, inside your body. Then came the natron salt for desiccation, the elaborate bandaging, the amulets placed between the layers of linen. All of this to ensure you could enjoy your eternal buffet with Osiris. So, while you might have lived in luxury, your body was seen as a temporary vessel, a divine housing unit that needed rigorous maintenance for its earthly term and even more rigorous preparation for its eternal vacation. It really makes you appreciate modern medicine, doesn't it? No crocodile dung required. Being pharaoh wasn't all about intricate rituals and dodging poison dates. A significant and often brutal part of your role was that of supreme commander. You weren't just a spiritual leader. You were the nation's chief warrior, expected to lead your armies into battle, expand the empire, and put down rebellions with ruthless efficiency. Forget the peaceful, agricultural imagery. Ancient Egypt, like most empires, was built and maintained through the sharp edge of the sword. And you, the divine ruler, were at its very tip. Imagine gearing up for war. You'd don elaborate battle regalia, perhaps a distinctive blue crown adorned with a cobra, signifying your authority. Your chariots, the elite fighting force of the new kingdom, would be readied, their bronze fittings gleaming under the sun. Mainstream historical fact: pharaohs often personally led their armies into battle, riding at the head of their chariot divisions. While their actual combat involvement is debated, their presence was crucial for morale and to symbolize divine sanction for the campaign. Think of Ramesses II at the Battle of Kadesh, famously depicted charging into the Hittite lines, though likely a heroic exaggeration of events. Still, you had to look the part, which meant being front and center, even if your actual fighting involved more strategic oversight than swinging a sword. The campaigns themselves were grueling. Long marches through scorching deserts, logistical nightmares of supplying thousands of soldiers, and the constant threat of ambush. You'd be strategizing with your generals, receiving intelligence from scouts, and performing rituals to ensure divine victory. And when battle was joined, it was a chaotic, bloody affair. The clash of bronze weapons, the thud of arrows, the screams of the wounded. A quirky tidbit: Egyptian art often depicts pharaohs holding enemies by their hair and smiting them with a mace, a highly symbolic, almost ritualistic portrayal of conquest rather than a literal depiction of combat. However, it vividly conveyed your role as the destroyer of enemies and protector of Egypt. You probably wouldn't actually be executing prisoners by hand, but the propaganda certainly made it look like you would. Victory meant plunder, prestige, and often a fresh supply of captives to be put to work on your grand building projects. Defeat, however, could mean humiliation, loss of territory, and a significant blow to your divine prestige. And rebellions? They were met with swift and brutal force. You couldn't allow any challenge to your authority, divine or otherwise, to stand. The consequences for your enemies, both foreign and domestic, were severe. You'd see the captured foes paraded through the streets, perhaps even their leaders publicly executed or impaled as a stark warning. Historians still argue whether the pharaoh's personal presence on a battlefield was a genuine tactical advantage or primarily a psychological one, designed to inspire their troops and intimidate their foes. Was it truly courageous leadership, or was it a calculated risk to maintain the myth of the invincible God King? Either way, the pressure was immense. If you faltered, if you showed fear, it could unravel the entire campaign, and by extension, your divine legitimacy. So you stood tall in your chariot, even if your knees were knocking, projecting an image of unwavering power. Just remember to pack extra water for those long marches, and maybe a few good luck charms. You can never be too careful when divine favor is on the line, especially when arrows are flying. Beyond the battlefield and the palace walls, you, the pharaoh, carried an even heavier, more existential burden: the responsibility for the very ebb and flow of nature itself. To the ancient Egyptians, the pharaoh wasn't just a ruler. You were the cosmic link, the one who ensured the Nile flooded annually, the sun rose each morning, and the crops grew. When things went wrong and the Nile failed to rise, or famine gripped the land, it wasn't just bad luck. It was a direct reflection of your perceived failure, a sign of divine wrath, and a potent source of public unrest. Imagine the anxiety as the time for the Nile flood approached. Your entire kingdom's survival hinged on it. No flood, no fertile silt, no crops, no food. Mainstream historical fact: The annual inundation of the Nile was absolutely critical to Egyptian agriculture and therefore to the very survival of the civilization. The pharaoh was believed to have a direct role in ensuring its occurrence, often performing rituals at the Nile source or along its banks to encourage the floodwaters. You'd stand there, perhaps on the riverbank, surrounded by priests, performing ancient chants and offerings, silently praying that the gods in your own divine connection were strong enough to bring the life-giving waters. But what if the flood was low? Or worse, if it didn't come at all? The immediate consequences were devastating. Widespread crop failure, starvation, and economic collapse. And the political fallout for you, the pharaoh, would be catastrophic. Your people, who saw you as a living god, would inevitably question your divinity, your efficacy, and your right to rule. Whispers of your weakness, of the gods turning their backs on you, would spread like wildfire. A quirky tidbit from the first intermediate period, a time of political fragmentation, speaks of periods of severe drought and famine, leading many historians to believe that the breakdown of central authority was closely linked to the perceived failure of the pharaoh to maintain cosmic order and prosperity. You'd be forced to respond, perhaps with grand public rituals, claiming to appease angry gods, or by initiating massive public works projects to distribute what little food was available, trying desperately to reassert your divine favor. Historians still argue whether some pharaohs were genuinely blamed by the populace for natural disasters, or if political rivals simply exploited these crises to undermine the reigning monarch. Was it true spiritual disillusionment or shrewd political opportunism? Either way, the pressure to deliver was immense. You couldn't just shrug your shoulders and blame climate change. You were the climate change solution or the source of the problem. The sight of your people starving, of barren fields stretching to the horizon, would have been a stark, terrifying reminder of the fragility of your divine power. Every withered plant, every emaciated face, was a testament to your apparent failure to uphold Ma'at. It was a burden that few modern leaders could even comprehend, to be held personally accountable for the weather, for the very bounty of the earth. So, while you sat on your golden throne, surrounded by luxury, a part of you was always scanning the skies, always watching the river gauge, praying that the gods wouldn't decide to send a cosmic memo informing your subjects that you were, in fact, just a very fancy human. Away from the public eye and the anxieties of cosmic order, you, the pharaoh, presided over another complex and often unsettling aspect of royal life, the royal harem. While the word harem conjures images of opulent leisure and sensual pleasure, the reality for the women within its wives, concubines, and their children was often one of political maneuvering, fierce rivalry, and constrained existence. For you, the pharaoh, it was less about romance and more about dynasty, alliances, and the constant production of potential heirs. Imagine your palace, a sprawling complex that included a dedicated section for the royal women. This wasn't just a place for leisure, it was a highly organized institution. Mainstream historical fact, pharaohs typically had one great royal wife, who held significant religious and political power and whose children were usually considered the primary heirs. However, they also maintained numerous secondary wives, concubines, and royal children from these unions, all housed within the harem system. These secondary wives often came from foreign lands, serving as diplomatic ties, or were daughters of powerful Egyptian nobles. You were in essence a walking, breathing political alliance machine. The lives of the women within the harem were tightly controlled. They had their own staff, their own apartments, and perhaps even their own economic enterprises, but their freedom was limited. Their primary purpose was to produce children, especially male heirs, to secure the future of the dynasty. For the great royal wife, her position was paramount, but even she navigated a complex web of alliances and rivalries with the other women and their factions. Imagine the pressure on these women, especially if they struggled to produce a male heir, or if their son was perceived as weaker than a son from another wife. A quirky tidbit, some pharaohs had dedicated harem managers whose job it was to oversee the daily lives of the women resolve disputes, and ensure the smooth running of this vast domestic and political ecosystem. This wasn't a love nest. It was a well-oiled machine for royal reproduction and political stability. You might occasionally visit a secondary wife or concubine, but your interactions were often formal, designed to produce offspring or maintain diplomatic relations, rather than personal affection. Historians still argue whether the women of the harem held any true political power or if they were largely pawns in the Pharaohs' dynastic games. While the great royal wife clearly wielded influence, the extent to which other royal women could plot, influence, or even directly participate in palace intrigues is a subject of ongoing debate. Remember that harem conspiracy against Ramesses III? That originated right here, demonstrating that the women, despite their restricted lives, were far from powerless when it came to their own ambitions or those of their sons. So, while you might have had a seemingly endless supply of companionship, your personal life was inextricably linked to the demands of the state. Every relationship was scrutinized for its political implications. Every child a potential piece in the grand, dangerous game of succession. It was a life of gilded cages, where even love, if it existed, was overshadowed by duty and the cold calculation of power. It makes you wonder if anyone in that palace genuinely found peace, or if everyone, including you, was just waiting for the next political tremor. The constant performance of divinity, the brutal realities of empire, and the insidious threats within your own palace converge to place an almost unimaginable psychological toll on you, the pharaoh. Being considered a living god sounds like the ultimate ego boost, but it was also an immense burden, a gilded cage where every action, every thought, was magnified and scrutinized for its cosmic implications. You couldn't just be a person. You had to be the perfect, infallible link between humanity and the divine. Imagine the isolation. Who could you truly confide in? Your advisors were potential conspirators. Your family members were often political rivals or pawns, and your subjects worshipped you from a distance, terrified of your power. Mainstream historical fact. Pharaohs were deliberately set apart from the general populace through elaborate rituals, dress, and strict protocol, reinforcing their divine and unapproachable status. This served to maintain their authority, but undoubtedly contributed to their psychological isolation. You couldn't just pop down to the local market for a chat or vent about your day over a beer. Every interaction was a formal, carefully choreographed dance. This isolation could lead to profound loneliness. You might be surrounded by opulence and attendance, but genuine human connection would be a rare and risky luxury. Every smile could be a feigned gesture, every compliment a veiled manipulation. A quirky tidbit: some pharaohs are believed to have sought solace in artistic pursuits, like Akhenaten's revolutionary focus on naturalistic art, or through personal religious devotion, perhaps a quiet prayer to their favored deity that transcended the formal state cult. Imagine a god-king needing a hobby to cope with the stress, perhaps dabbling in pottery or writing very long, epic poems about himself. The constant pressure to be perfect would have been crushing. If the Nile didn't flood, if a plague swept through the land, if a rival kingdom threatened your border, it was all your fault, a sign that you had somehow failed in your divine duties, or that the gods were displeased with you. Historians still argue whether the pharaohs experienced periods of genuine mental distress or depression due to this immense pressure and isolation. Did they truly believe in their own infallibility, or was there a quiet, nagging doubt beneath the divine facade, a crushing weight of imposter syndrome despite all the gold and glory? You had to project an image of unwavering strength, even when internally you might have been battling illness, grief, or simply profound exhaustion. Think of the sheer mental fortitude required to continually perform the role of a living deity, knowing that any slip, any human failing, could be interpreted as a catastrophic omen for the entire kingdom. It was a role without breaks, without true anonymity, a constant performance for an audience of millions and, supposedly, the gods themselves. So, while the gold mask of Tutankhamun might seem regal and serene, remember the likely reality of the man beneath it. A young king, burdened by the expectations of a divine lineage, navigating a treacherous court, and bearing the crushing weight of an entire civilization's fate on his shoulders. Not exactly a recipe for a restful night's sleep, even for a god. The burden of divinity and the isolation it brought were often compounded by the volatile nature of succession. For you, the pharaoh, the question of who would inherit your throne was a constant, gnawing worry, and for the kingdom, it was a period of immense instability. Child kings, contested claims, and sudden, unexpected deaths meant that the transition of power was rarely smooth, often plunging Egypt into periods of chaos and uncertainty. Imagine the anxiety surrounding the birth of an heir, especially a male one. Every pharaoh needed a son, or at least a strong, designated successor, to ensure the continuity of the dynasty and, by extension, the stability of the cosmos. Mainstream historical fact: the lack of a clear heir or a weak one frequently led to succession crises, usurpations, or periods of political fragmentation, such as the intermediate periods in Egyptian history. These weren't just theoretical concerns. They were existential threats to the very fabric of Egyptian society. If your designated heir was a child, as was often the case due to early deaths or long reigns, you faced the daunting prospect of regency. A child pharaoh meant that real power would reside with a regent, often the queen mother, a powerful vizier, or a military general. While some regents were loyal, many saw it as an opportunity to consolidate their own power, sometimes even sidelining or eliminating the young king when he came of age. A quirky tidbit: the famous pharaoh Hatshepsut initially ruled as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, but then boldly declared herself pharaoh in her own right, blurring the lines of gender and legitimate succession in unprecedented ways. It's safe to say that royal childcare in ancient Egypt came with extremely high stakes. Historians still argue whether the succession process was primarily based on primogeniture, firstborn son, or if other factors like a mother's status, divine omens, or political maneuvering played a more significant role in determining the legitimate heir. Was it truly about the bloodline, or about who could rally the most support among the powerful elites? This ambiguity meant that even with an apparent heir, the throne was never truly secure until the new pharaoh was firmly established. You would have spent years grooming your heir, instructing them in the complex rituals, the art of governance, and the brutal realities of power. But what if they died prematurely? What if they proved to be weak or incompetent? The pressure to produce not just an heir, but a capable heir was immense. And for the child king himself, imagine being thrust onto the throne at a tender age, surrounded by cunning adults vying for influence, constantly reminded of your divine duties, while struggling with the very human frailties of youth. It was a terrifying gauntlet to run, and many didn't survive it, whether due to illness, accident, or more nefarious means. The divine right to rule might have been bestowed by the gods, but maintaining it often required a very sharp political mind and an even sharper set of teeth. Beyond the intricacies of lineage and the fragility of succession, your power as pharaoh extended to the very sinews of Egyptian society, its economy and its labor. You weren't just the spiritual head. You were the chief executive, the supreme landlord, and the ultimate taskmaster. Every resource, every harvest, and every able-bodied person was, in essence, your property to be exploited for the glory of Egypt and, more importantly, for the glory of you and your eternal resting place. Imagine the sheer scale of your economic control. The land itself, the lifeblood of Egypt, was ultimately yours. Mainstream historical fact: the pharaoh owned all the land in Egypt, or at least had ultimate dominion over it. Peasants worked the land, giving a significant portion of their produce as taxes or rent to the state, effectively to the pharaoh and the temples that served him. You controlled the granaries, the mines, the quarries, and the vast networks of trade. Every commodity, from gold to papyrus, passed through your hands, or at least through the hands of your appointed officials. It was a top-down economy of immense proportions, with you at the absolute pinnacle. This absolute control meant you could mobilize vast numbers of people for your grand public works. We've talked about the pyramids, but think about the temples, the irrigation canals, the massive statues, and the cities themselves. These weren't built by free contractors. They were built by the conscripted labor of your subjects. A quirky tidbit: during periods of intense building, entire villages might be emptied of their male population, forced to work on a royal project for months or even years, often far from home. Imagine being a farmer, seeing your tools idle, and being told you were off to haul stone for a new temple dedicated to your living God King. You wouldn't exactly be packing a picnic lunch. Historians still argue whether the Egyptian economy was truly a command economy, where every aspect was centrally controlled by the pharaoh, or if there was more fluidity and private enterprise than previously understood. Was it pure authoritarian control, or did the vast bureaucracy allow for a degree of individual initiative? Either way, your whim, your ambition, could redirect immense resources and human labor on a scale almost unthinkable today. And the revenue generated by this system? It fueled your opulent lifestyle, of course, but it also funded your armies, maintained your vast bureaucracy, and ensured that the temples continued to sing your praises. You were the ultimate beneficiary and the ultimate justification for this immense exploitation of resources and human effort. The lives of your subjects, their toil, their sweat, all contributed directly to your divine majesty and your quest for eternal glory. It was a perpetual motion machine of labor and tribute, all spinning around you, the divine sun at its center. So, while you reap the rewards, remember that every glittering jewel, every perfectly carved hieroglyph, represented countless hours of backbreaking, poorly compensated labor by your loyal, or perhaps just resigned, subjects. To maintain this extraordinary level of power and control, you, the pharaoh, relied heavily on something even more potent than armies or economic might: the careful cultivation of a cult of personality and pervasive propaganda. You weren't just a ruler, you were a meticulously crafted brand, a divine celebrity whose image and mythology permeated every aspect of your subjects' lives. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate, sophisticated strategy to ensure unwavering loyalty and legitimate your absolute authority. Imagine the sheer volume of imagery dedicated to you. Your colossal statues, towering over temples and public squares, depicting you as eternally youthful, impossibly strong, and always victorious. Relief carvings on temple walls showing you smiting enemies, receiving blessings from gods, or performing miraculous feats. Mainstream historical fact: pharaohs extensively used art, architecture, and inscriptions as forms of propaganda, creating a consistent visual narrative of their divine right, power, and achievements, often exaggerating their victories and minimizing their defeats. You were quite literally everywhere, your face etched into the very landscape of Egypt. This wasn't just about showing off, it was about shaping reality. Every inscription, every painted scene, every monumental gate was a carefully curated message. You were the bringer of order, the protector of Egypt, the favored son of Ra. A quirky tidbit: some pharaohs even orchestrated their own divine birth stories, claiming to be the literal offspring of a god and their mortal queen long after they were born. Think of Hatshepsut, whose temple reliefs at Deir el-Bahari depict her divine conception and birth, legitimizing her unprecedented rule as a female pharaoh by making her parentage literally divine. It's the ultimate spin doctoring centuries before public relations was even a twinkle in anyone's eye. Historians still argue whether the Egyptian populace genuinely believed in the pharaoh's divinity, or if it was a pragmatic acceptance of the existing power structure, reinforced by centuries of propaganda. Was it faith, or simply fear and tradition? Either way, the message was clear and inescapable. You were chosen, you were powerful, and you were worthy of absolute obedience. This propaganda wasn't just for your subjects, it was for you too. You grew up surrounded by these images, these narratives, reinforcing your own belief in your unique, divine destiny. You controlled the narrative completely. If a battle was less than a resounding success, it became a glorious triumph in the temple reliefs. If a famine occurred, it was quickly reinterpreted as a minor setback overcome by your divine intervention. You were the hero of every story, the solution to every problem, and the ultimate guarantor of Mott. This constant barrage of self-aggrandizement created an almost impenetrable shield around your authority, making it incredibly difficult for anyone to challenge your rule without also challenging the very cosmic order you embodied. It's a testament to ancient marketing, proving that if you tell a story enough times and loudly enough, people will eventually believe it. Even after your elaborate mummification and the sealing of your magnificent tomb, your troubles as Pharaoh were far from over. In fact, a new layer of dread emerged. The pervasive fear of the curse of the Pharaohs and the very real threat of your eternal resting place being violated. While modern popular culture has sensationalized the curse, the underlying anxiety about tomb desecration was a very real, disturbing aspect of your posthumous existence. Imagine the painstaking effort, the immense resources, and the hundreds of years dedicated to building and furnishing your eternal home. Every gold artifact, every jewel, every piece of furniture, every jar of preserved food, all were intended to accompany you into the afterlife, to ensure your eternal comfort and continued divine power. Mainstream historical fact. Ancient Egyptian tombs were frequently robbed, even in antiquity, despite elaborate protective measures like false walls, hidden chambers, and curses inscribed on tomb walls. The wealth buried with pharaohs made them irresistible targets for professional tomb robbers. You spent your life preparing for eternity, only for enterprising mortals to try and ransack your spiritual luggage. The curse wasn't just a spooky tale for tourists. For the ancient Egyptians, disturbing the dead, especially a pharaoh, was a grave offense with very real spiritual consequences. Inscriptions warning of dire fate's blindness, disease, violent death were etched into tomb entrances and sarcophagi. These weren't just psychological deterrents. They were believed to be active, magical protections. A quirky tidbit. Some scholars suggest that the curse might have had a practical, albeit morbid, basis in diseases carried by dust or molds inside sealed tombs, making those who first opened them genuinely ill. So, maybe it wasn't a spiritual curse, but a really potent case of ancient black mold. Historians still argue whether the elaborate curses found in tombs were primarily meant to deter robbers, or if they were genuinely believed to invoke divine retribution. Did the tomb robbers, who often came from impoverished backgrounds, truly fear the curse, or was the lure of unimaginable wealth too great to resist? Either way, the constant cycle of tomb building and tomb robbing became a disturbing paradox of Egyptian funerary culture. You, as pharaoh, would have dedicated immense resources to securing your afterlife, only to know, deep down, that future generations might very well dismantle your efforts piece by piece. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 brought the idea of the curse into the modern consciousness, fueled by the mysterious deaths of some members of the excavation team. While later attributed to unrelated causes, the myth solidified. But long before Howard Carter, you, the pharaoh, knew the vulnerability of your eternal resting place. The pharaohs were buried not just with treasures, but with a profound fear that even in death, their peace and their eternal journey could be disturbed by the greed of the living. It makes you wonder if they ever truly rested easy, even under tons of stone. And so, after centuries of divine rule, of monumental achievements and disturbing realities, the legacy of pharaohs often dwindled to dust, their empires fading, and their glory becoming merely a whisper carried on the desert winds. You, the pharaoh, aimed for eternal life, for an unbreakable dynasty. But the relentless march of time and the inevitable rise and fall of civilizations meant that your absolute power would eventually crumble, leaving behind only echoes of your disturbing reign. Imagine the grand visions you had for your legacy. your name inscribed for eternity, your temples standing strong for 1,000 years, your descendants ruling indefinitely. Mainstream historical fact. Despite their immense power, many pharaonic dynasties ended abruptly, either through internal collapse, foreign conquest, or simply the lack of a suitable heir. The New Kingdom, for instance, arguably Egypt's most powerful era, eventually fragmented and fell, giving way to periods of foreign rule. Your ambition for eternal dominance often clashed with the very human frailties of succession, politics, and the shifting sands of geopolitical power. Your colossal statues might stand for millennia, but often they were defaced, usurped by later pharaohs who carved their own names over yours, or simply toppled by conquering armies. Your meticulously prepared tombs, despite curses and hidden passages, were almost universally plundered, leaving your mummified remains disturbed and stripped of their treasures. A quirky tidbit: pharaohs often reused older monuments, dismantling them to build their own, or repurposing existing statues by carving their cartouches onto them. This meant that even your physical legacy wasn't safe from the ambitions of future god kings, who probably didn't care much for historical preservation. Historians still argue whether the ultimate decline of pharaonic Egypt was due primarily to internal weaknesses, such as corruption and civil strife, or external pressures, like repeated invasions by foreign powers. Was it a slow, internal decay, or a series of fatal blows from outside? Either way, the era of the Pharaohs, which lasted for over 3,000 years, eventually came to an end, giving way to Persian, Greek, and then Roman rule. The last pharaoh, Cleopatra VII, was Greek, a tragic figure whose desperate attempts to restore Egypt's former glory ultimately failed. You, who wielded the power of a god, who built monuments that defied time, ultimately succumbed to it. Your name might still be remembered, your face adorning museum exhibits, but the disturbing realities of your existence, the isolation, the paranoia, the inbreeding, the relentless pressure of divinity faded into the background, leaving only the sanitized image of an ancient legend. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? That even a god king, after all the power, all the ritual, all the monumental effort, ends up as just a whisper in the wind, a curiosity for those of us millennia later, trying to piece together the fragments of a disturbing life lived in blinding gold. And now, as the last grains of sand settle on our journey through ancient Egypt, feel the final echoes of the pharaohs' disturbing lives drift away. Let the harsh desert sun dim to a gentle twilight, and the echoes of their grand ambitions soften into a distant hum. The weight of their crowns, the fear of their conspiracies, the toll of their divinity, all of it fades now, like ancient hieroglyphs smoothed by the desert wind. You've seen the disturbing truths, the unsettling realities behind the glittering facade. But now, it's time to let those images recede, to let the stillness of the night embrace you. Breathe slowly, deeply. The long, disturbing history is over, replaced by the quiet comfort of your own bed. There's nothing left to fear, no ancient curse, no demanding god king to appease. Just peace and the promise of a long, undisturbed night's rest. Close your eyes and drift away into sweet, sweet sleep.